Have you ever thought about what the last thing you'll see before you die might be? It's not exactly a comforting thought, but in the late 1800s, scientists were doing something really weird with that theory. They believed that the last thing a person saw might actually remain in the eye, not as a memory, but as an image. For a brief period in history, researchers believed that the human eye might work like a camera, capturing and preserving a final image that a person saw before death. If that image could somehow be developed using chemicals, it might reveal what the person had been looking at in their last moments. This was a strange idea, called optography. At the time, people genuinely believed it might solve murders. The idea mostly came from the work of a German psychologist called Wilhelm Friedrich Kühne. Kühne was studying the chemistry of vision in the late 19th century. Scientists had recently discovered that the retina, that's the light-sensitive layer at the back of the eye, contained a pigment called rhodopsin, sometimes known as visual purple. The pigment reacts to light. When light enters the eye, rhodopsin breaks down chemically, triggering signals that allow the brain to interpret images. But Kühne wondered if this chemical reaction might hold on to the pattern of light that it had just seen. In other words, could the retina preserve the last image someone looked at? To test this theory, Kühne started conducting his experiments. He mostly experimented on animals, particularly rabbits, but the experiments were deeply unsettling, even by the standards of the time. Kühne would often place a rabbit facing a bright, clearly defined object, usually a window with bars. After the rabbit died, he would quickly remove the eyes and treat the retina with a chemical substance in a dark room. What he was looking for was the outline of an image the rabbit had seen just before its death. These images were called optograms. They weren't clear photographs, just shadowy shapes and patterns left behind, ghostly impressions left scarred into the retina. One of Kühne's most famous experiments involved a rabbit that was placed next to a bright window. After the rabbit died, he processed the eyes and claimed that the retina showed a faint pattern resembling the bars of the window. Not a detailed image, but enough to make people wonder if the eye really did capture the rabbit's final view. There were even attempts to examine the eyes of recently executed criminals to see if an optogram could be recovered. However, these efforts didn't produce any convincing results. Any pattern that appeared was vague and impossible to interpret. Still, the idea refused to disappear. As the idea of optography spread through scientific circles and sensational newspaper reports in the 19th century, some investigators began wondering whether it could actually help solve crimes. At the time, photography itself was relatively new, and the idea that the eye might work like a biological camera seemed strangely believable. And once people started to think about that possibility, it didn't take long for the idea to take a dark turn. If the eye could preserve the last thing someone saw, what if that person had been murdered? Suddenly, optography wasn't just the curiosity of the vision science. Some people believe it become a tool for forensic investigation. Imagine photographing the eye of a murder victim and seeing the culprit right there. It sounds like something from a horror story, but in the late 1800s, newspapers and scientists genuinely discussed the possibility. As interest grew, researchers began wondering if optograms could be taken from the human eye as well. Some of the most disturbing discussions about optograms involved death by guillotine. During the 19th century, the guillotine was still being used in European countries, and there was an ongoing debate about how long the brain remained conscious after decapitation. Some scientists wondered if the retina might briefly contain the last image of the condemned person, even after the blade fell. During the panic surrounding the murders committed by Jack the Ripper in 1888, newspapers even speculated that the victim's eyes might contain who Jack truly was. In one reported instance, police photographed the eye of a victim shortly after death, just in case the retina had preserved a glimpse of the murderer. The hope was unsettling. If the rumours were true, the victim could reveal who their attacker was in their final moments. In reality, nothing was ever discovered from these photographs, but the fact that investigators considered it The fact that they took the photographs just shows you how much weight this theory had behind it. Another case took place in 1924 in Haiger, Germany. On December 1st, 1924, German merchant Fritz Augustin murdered 8 people, including his wife, relatives, and employees at his home. He used a mixture of stabbing and brute force with an axe. He later set fire to the house to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. During the investigation, a professor from the University of Cologne named Professor Dohn photographed the retinas of 2 of the victims in an attempt to produce an optogram. According to reports at the time, the image supposedly showed Augustin's face and the axe that he had used to attack the victims. When Augustin was told that the victims' eyes supposedly captured images identifying him as the killer, he reportedly confessed to all 8 of the murders. He was later tried and sentenced to death and executed in 1925. However, modern historians and scientists are very skeptical that the optograms showed anything meaningful. Most experts now believe that the images were either misrepresented or completely fabricated, and the confession likely happened because Augustin believed the evidence against him was real. By the end of the 19th century, scientists began to realise that optography simply didn't work in the way that they had hoped. While the retina does react chemically to light, it does not preserve detailed images like photographic film. The patterns that Kühne observed were completely unusable and incredibly vague. At the very best, they just showed the difference between light and dark areas. Nothing recognisable as pictures, and certainly not the face of a murderer. Gradually, optography faded from serious scientific study, but interestingly, the idea didn't disappear. Instead, it found a new home in fiction. Writers quickly realised that the idea was a perfect concept for horror and detective stories. The thought that the victim's eyes might secretly record the moment of their death was deeply unsettling, but also strangely compelling. One early fictional example is a short story, The Telltale Eye, where optography plays an essential role in finding out who committed the crime. Since then, the concept has appeared in countless mystery novels, short stories, and films. Even today, you'll see it referenced in crime stories or thrillers, usually as a dramatic way to reveal the killer. But in reality, modern science has completely rejected the idea of optography. The human eye just doesn't store images after death. Vision is not a photograph stored within the retina. It is a complex process where light signals are constantly being sent to the brain and interpreted in real time. Once the brain stops functioning, those images disappear. Still, the story of optography remains one of the strangest in the history of science. For a brief moment, researchers really believed that the eye of the dead might hold their final moment. A silent photograph, hidden in the retina, waiting to be revealed. And even though the science turned out to be wrong, the idea still lingers somewhere between science and horror. Because once you hear about optography, it's hard to get that idea out of your head. And maybe even harder not to wonder, what was the last thing someone saw? What do you think? Do you think it could ever be possible for the eye to preserve the final image? Or is optography always destined to be one of history's strangest scientific dead ends? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if there are any other creepy pieces of science, strange experiments, or eerie historical theories you'd like me to explore in future videos, feel free to suggest them down below. I'd love to hear your ideas. Thank you for watching.